All right, hopefully everyone's still awake. The last half hour here. Neil's escaping.
Give me your answer real quick, Mike.
Oh yeah, so what was your question again? We'll start with that one.
I was just wondering how your new program is.
Oh yeah, the pantry question. Yeah, so Brian earlier was probably throwing some shade at food pantries. We have one. However, so I mentioned in my opening remarks that I came in June of 2019. I was not even here a full year when COVID hit in March of 2020. So I was, and kind of when I came in, my philosophy is okay, spend the first year not really doing too much tinker other than some very basic things like this is something that's an easy fix. Like when I first came, we didn't have any donor management software. So I came in asking the question of, okay, who are our donors? And I was like, well, I guess we can pull up in QuickBooks maybe and see. So there wasn't really a good answer to that. I was like, okay, well, this is an easy fix that will greatly help us figure out the budget and everything. But otherwise, most of my first year was primarily just trying to listen and watch and observe the organization, see what's happening, learn the history and all that. And of course, made it about 7 months in, and then it's like, oh, by the way, you've got to change everything because everything's shutting down. There's this pandemic, and so it's like, oh, okay. And we are very fortunate enough that we had the facilities to make a lot of those pivots easily. Because we at the time had been operating a client choice food pantry, where people would come in and a very traditional, typical pantry. And walk with the volunteer around, select the items if they wanted, all that, but it's very much prescripted. So then March 2020, you have to do social distancing, so we converted that all to a drive-through food pantry. And for the past 2.5 years or so, we've just kind of stuck with that. But it wasn't just simply us, like, okay, we just made that change and we're sticking with it. We really tried to take advantage of that time that everything was really wonky to do a lot of introspection, to do a lot of thinking about what we do, how can we do it better. So actually one of my seminary professors, when COVID hit, I saw that he had posted, I think, on Facebook or something, or did a little chat. And one of the things he said about that time was like, you never want to waste a good crisis. And that's kind of the philosophy that we had. And when COVID is like, okay, we've got this time, so like, for example, when everything was out of the actual food pantry building, we spent some time to do some renovations in there. But then also we were doing renovations, I'd say, internally, just as far as thinking through our theology and our philosophy of helping. And did a lot of readings, such as like When Helping Hurts and Toxic Charity, and kind of during that time also encountered True Charity Network. And a lot of these things are things I was already familiar with when I came into the organization as well. But I was also learning, and then as a staff we were learning. And so over the past year, we started evaluating, okay, what do we want the future of the food pantry to look like? Because we're coming out of COVID, so social distancing is not so much of a concern. And so started thinking through, okay, everything. And another challenge we were facing at the time is we were trying to do some of these other programs, but it was really like pulling teeth because the relationships weren't there. I mean, you can only have so much of a relationship when someone's in their car, they check in, and 2 or 3 minutes later they're out the door, right? And even when you are talking with them, you're still physically separated by a barrier, that car door. And so we were looking at that, and as we were surveying and talking to folks, we made a decision we need to bring people back inside because that's the starting point at least. So we made the decision earlier this year that we do want to return back inside for our food pantry. However, when we made that decision, we also said we don't just want to revert back to what we were doing before because we understand there's a lot of challenges with the way a traditional food pantry operates, in that it tends to strip dignity from people. It's very one-directional, and you see the same people over and over and over. And we looked very much into this concept of like a food co-op, which you may have heard Brian refer to that, and I know True Charity Network has a food co-op map, and we've consulted that. It's very useful. And so if you have an opportunity, I would definitely encourage you, especially if your church is involved with a food pantry at all, to look into that. So we really looked at that, and we haven't gone to a full food co-op yet. However, I would describe what we're trying to do as almost like a hybrid. It's very much experimental, and part of it is because we don't want to do crazy drastic changes right off, because we also understand that every community is unique and different. So, for example, we've visited Water Gardens and everything, and they have essentially a food co-op. that they run. It's a little food market where people can work and volunteer so much time in the Worth shopping or someplace on campus there, and then they can get to go shopping. One big difference between, say, Joplin and Bolivar is because I asked someone in Joplin, I was like, how many food pantries are in Joplin? I think they counted up in their heads like, at least a dozen.
Wow.
Whereas our community has done a pretty good job of avoiding duplication of services. So when you're talking about food pantries, other than maybe like a small food closet that some churches have, we pretty much are it. So we were like, okay, we got to think through that. We are different than other places, so we want to be careful because, for example, a place in Joplin might be able to just, we're just going to switch to a food co-op, and if people don't like that, they can get food at other places because there's a dozen other food pantries. Us, we don't necessarily have that same option. Also, we're hitting the time of inflation and thinking through, okay, how do we fund a food co-op? And because we do have a partnership with Ozarks Food Harvest, and that's where a very high percentage of our food comes from. And even thinking about, you could do retail pickups from like Walmart or Aldi or Come and Go or Woods. Challenges, even all those are tied up into Ozarks Food Harvest, and they're all under contract there, so we'd probably also lose out on all that food. So it's okay, we'd be spending probably a lot more money just to get food. Granted, we'd probably be serving less people. So what we did, at least for our starting point, is trying to create almost a hybrid model. So we do have a food pantry, but we structured it to look and feel very much like a grocery store, because we want as much as possible to emphasize the relationship is how we did that. So whereas our old model, you're basically put into a line, you took a number, you wait until your number's called, and you go back, and then someone walks with you, and you're still technically in a line. So when you walk inside, it looks very much like a grocery store, and so we actually will send people just in as groups, and you have the freedom to shop around wherever you want. And we've kind of bifurcated how it works, and so we've switched everything to a point system. And so we still have kind of a traditional food pantry model that people do get a certain amount of, we call them base points per month, but it's cut back from what it used to be for the amount that they get. And they can come in once a month and shop if that's all they want to do. That's the only level of commitment that they want. That's fine. Because we also try to see the food pantry as a hub for this is our first point of contact with people, and so that kind of gets them in the door. But we also have created opportunities where they can earn additional points, and we call them bonus points or pantry cash. And this is where Jordan mentioned the life skills classes, and that's where we've pretty much several times a week we've got classes that are happening, and we try to make them very participatory, and sometimes there's even homework assignments that they have to complete before they get all their points. But if they are engaging in those, and so we have classes on budgeting, on gardening, on mental health, a lot of the soft skills and things that you need to be successful that we're hearing about. And so as people are engaging and participating in those things, they have the opportunity to earn some additional points that they can then use in the pantry. And we're also exploring what are some other ways that we can create some systems of exchange. So it's not just simply, I'm just entitled to this, but it's no, this is something that you have earned. And there's been a lot of excitement. Before we did this, it was really hard to get people to actually plug into life skills classes, whereas now it's this is really interesting. And then there's also that excitement, I did something, I earned this, and now I'm shopping with something that I basically earned, versus it's just something I'm getting for free. So that's kind of what we've done, and it has been interesting. We're only about 2 months into this, and so, and perhaps one day we'll go full food co-op. But our goal right now is just simply to emphasize the relational side. And it's been really neat because whereas before, even when we were in person before, we sometimes have conversations, but it's very much I need to get them and get them out. So I know there was a Tuesday night that we were open a couple weeks back, and we weren't super busy, and the people that were shopping had the freedom to just chat. We didn't have to push them out. So we had shoppers that were talking with each other, they were talking with their volunteers, and as we were engaging in conversation with one of them, talking about those classes, because another one of our goals is to get them involved in even teaching classes, because one of these ideas is that, they're not just recipients, but they can be participants. And we know that there's people that are coming through our pantry that are excellent cooks. We know that there's people that can teach other skills to people, or there's people that are great at budgeting because they're living on a fixed income. They've got to make this work somehow every month in and month out. And so as we were just talking, as people were browsing around and shopping at their leisure, there's one lady that was talking about a class that'd be really great is teaching how to cook like casseroles or using things that you don't normally use. For example, like using old bananas to make banana bread, and but taking those things instead of just trashing it, how to use it to save money in your budget. And we kind of asked her, well, you seem like you know a lot about this. Would you be interested in teaching it? And so I think, was she the one that just taught the class, or do we have her coming up?
She's hopefully going to teach in November.
Yeah, so she's going to be teaching a class in November. So again, moving people from just simply going through a pantry and just being passive recipients to active participants. Christy, she had to leave, but she coordinates a lot of our volunteers. Another thing that she said is in the past month, we've had a number of our shoppers that have just on their own free will said, hey, can I volunteer in the pantry? It's like, yes, you can, because we're always looking for volunteers. And so we've got cashiers that is part of the pantry system, just like you do at the grocery store. And that's what Jordan is saying, that a lot of those folks are actually increasingly more people that are coming through. And we just had one lady that called us this past week and said, I need to get out of the house because I'm single and I'm elderly and I know it's not good for my health just to be here, and can I get involved? And we're like, yes, you can. We're still very early in this process, but even just that minor shift, we haven't gone, again, full food co-op, but just moving the direction towards systems of exchange and giving people that dignity has been very beneficial. So
We found that, you probably know this story, but one of our members down in Texas has done a food co-op for a really long time, and I think we used them as a resource to create our model action plan. And they've been going on long enough that some of their food co-op members have passed away, and that they tell us the story that we go to their funerals and there are more people at the funeral from the food co-op than from their family, because they created this family at the food co-op. They developed relationships and increased their social capital, and I just think that's so cool because they're part of something rather than coming to just get something. They feel like part of something.
Yeah, that may have actually been the food co-op up in Indiana or Illinois.
Okay.
Because we actually talked to them back in December, and then he shared that very same story that they had a member pass away, and had 2 family members, but then a dozen food co-op members. Again, it's about that community and the relationships. Other questions?
Bryan, do you pay somebody to write your grants, or is that a volunteer position? And do you I don't know if there's a typical answer for the turnover, and how do you gauge setting up your programs if a portion of your resources is based on grants,
Yeah. So that's kind of a two-folded question. So some of our grants are capital items. So they're one and done. They're for the purchase of something. And depending on the size of the grant or the type of grant, we might write that in-house. For our larger grants, we'll hire a grant writer. We are also aligned with Missouri Foundation for Health, and so they'll actually provide grant writers if it's a nationally competitive grant versus just a Missouri grant. Our vice president of our board does a lot of our grant writing at a pretty nominal rate for us. She's the VP, and I think we're trying to get away from grants the more we can. Unfortunately, they keep throwing more money down out there. But our goal is to become more self-generating revenue, so that we're about 50% of revenue that we generate ourselves through our programs and services, and then about 25% grants and 25% individual donors. So that's kind of where we're trying to get to. And we'll do that through our tiny house development. The people will pay rent to we'll be the landlords, so they'll pay us rent. Through our moped program, we'll have rentals available as well for that, so people can rent those scooters. So
just to add on to that, so in the nonprofit world, there's a saying that nonprofit is your tax status. It's not your business model. we still need to have money to do the things that you're doing. And so unfortunately, some of us in like the church world or nonprofit world, we get stuck in a thing like, well, I'm not supposed to make a profit, so I can't make smart business decisions. But I think that's where like things like social enterprise can play a role, that if you can tie that social enterprise into your ministry, and then it can also be generating income as well. If you run it as a good business, then it kind of helps you on both fronts there. Because we have the same philosophy, so we actually have not received a whole lot of grants for what we are doing. And when I have gone after grants, I primarily go after like capital, so it is the one and done. Because I think we want to model the same values that we want to teach other people. It's like if we're telling other people, hey, don't become dependent on the government, don't become dependent on other people. What does it mean if we as a nonprofit are dependent on those sources of funding of like, well, we got this grant every single year, and if you lose it, then we're in trouble because it pays for 3 of my staff. And in the previous nonprofit I worked at, we were about 70 or 80% grant funded in the domestic violence world. But you also had those decisions of like, a lot of those grant sources were pretty consistent, but then once they did dry up, then you had to have some hard conversations like, we gotta let you go because your program is ending. Whereas if you can be more self-funded through private donations, social enterprise, or like we have an endowment fund too, and have some rental income that comes in, then that creates that sustainable revenue. The other piece too is you don't want to be dependent because then you're tied to other people's rules too. So yeah.
Yeah, there's often a string attached. Like, you get this money, but you have to do it the way we tell you to do it.
Other questions?
I've got a couple, I'm not sure how to ask them. What would you say the greatest need is outside of resources, of course, as far as services? Like what I'm thinking of actually are sex offenders. Do you have a lot of sex offenders that you're serving, and the resources out there? It seems to me that they're today's lepers as far as looking for help for them. And it's such a wide range of people that fall under that category.
Yes, agreed.
So what are the biggest like gaps in services in your community or
Thank
populations that aren't being addressed?
Yeah.
We're passing it to you.
I don't know yet. You know, I think for us it's the elderly. I told someone the other day we tend to take the elderly and just toss them aside. There's a lot of information, there's a lot of knowledge, and we need to glean from that. Also, I see, especially healthcare. You know, I would just say my mother-in-law per se is in ill health, and she's not getting. There's just a big gap there that she's not getting. Services, I know that's a service, but I just think it's the elderly, in my area anyway. I just feel like they're kind of pushed aside a little bit.
Do you think advocacy would help for them? Like I have a nurse friend that just started a ministry, and what she does is advocacy work for medical.
Yeah, I do. My senior pastor is a nurse practitioner in the ER, so I have him to rely on. You know, he is all for that, but just in the everyday day-to-day life, I think they are receiving the short end of the stick. I really do. That's my opinion.
All right, I'll take a stab at your question. So that's a tough area, sex offenders.
Yeah.
Because the data tells us that only about 5% of sex offenders will actually be rehabilitated. So if you separate church and state, right? Put church over here for a moment. As nonprofits, organizations, anyone that's running anything that's dealing with the public, your insurance is going to dictate how you can do something and how you can't do something, especially when it comes to sex offenders, right? So if you have kids anywhere in your facility, or if your services are available to kids, then sex offenders have to be aware of that and or tell you that they're a sex offender. Most of the time they won't come out and freely tell you that. And then you look at the church side of things. As Christ followers, we are supposed to believe in grace and redemption, right? But it's challenging. There's not a lot of places for known sex offenders to congregate, or live, for that matter. You know, a lot of places now do background checks, and I've seen some semi-successful models. I know that in Florida there's actually a trailer park that's dedicated for sex offenders that come out of the prison system. That way they have a place to live. But I know also they're very harassed by the public. So it's a hard area to navigate for sure.
So going back to that, very early on in my ministry, we had a gentleman in our church that just got out of prison and was a sex offender. We met with his parole officer several times, and you're right, there's a 95% chance that he's going to reoffend. So we had to have some hard conversations with him. We actually put a plan into action where he was not alone by himself with anyone. We had someone meet him in the parking lot, and we sat by him, and then we walked him back to his car if he had to get up to go to the bathroom, whatever. He was, watched pretty close. And again, we checked with insurance, what's the whole situation there, but we still minister to him like, we would anyone. It's just, he had to understand that there was a certain protocol that he had to follow. He did it. He didn't like it at the beginning, but that's where his wife took him back. Their marriage was restored, and so she didn't want to go anywhere else, and he wanted to be there, so we accommodated him. But we didn't change our ministry to him. We just had to keep close watch where he was, what he did, anything like that. She did have to, the wife ran the bus ministry, so she, quit that, of course. But we just ministered him like normal. It's just when he was in our presence, he had to be eyes on him all the time.
Second part of your question was what resources or what other things do we need to look at? I would say one of the biggest challenges that's happening right now is with our kids, and specifically around early childhood trauma. So I remember one year, we have an annual Thanksgiving dinner. That's how we started, and so we just keep that going. And we asked for volunteers all over the community to come and be a part of that. And I remember one year I had a pastor's wife refer to some of the kids that were there with their parents eating our Thanksgiving dinner, refer to them as children raised in the wild. And it dawned on me that she did not understand the effects of early childhood trauma. And oftentimes, middle-class people, teachers, think of these kids as, even doctors will misdiagnose them as having ADHD and prescribe Ritalin to them at an early age, or Adderall, which then turns them into a methamphetamine addict by the time they're 15, 16 years old. And really what has happened is they've experienced early childhood trauma. And so let me tell you what that looks like, because I know when I first heard it, I really didn't understand what that means. But if Chip and I walk out into the woods and we see a bear, there's a chemical reaction in our body that alerts us to danger, right? And our brain starts processing this adrenaline and noradrenaline through our brain. It heightens our senses. It makes us aware that this bear is there in this danger. we retreat from that situation, we get away from the bear, our system goes back to normal because the danger's not present any longer. You take a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old who lives in our case, in a motel room where either a parent's in addiction or abusive, or not present because they're a single parent and they're working and the 2 or 3-year-old child is left there all day by themselves. That adrenaline, that chemical is going all day long. And so it's rewiring and remapping the brain of that child. So what we'll see is that kid will come in, because we have an after-school program, that kid will come in and he'll be bouncing off the walls. He or she will be bouncing off the walls, all over the place. We can put that kid on a sit and spin thing, and they'll sit there and spin for 10 minutes, and it's almost like it rewires or remaps the chemical in their brain, and after that you can actually have conversation with them. But when we don't recognize what early childhood trauma does, we perpetuate the problem. Just like I said, we prescribe drugs, and then the kid becomes an addict, and then we're repeating everything later on in adulthood. And so I think that would be the biggest thing, is really to understand the brokenness of families and how it all is starting, because that's really where the trajectory starts on all of this stuff, and it's education.
Yeah, and I appreciate you bringing up about the impact of trauma. So I mentioned in my introduction I used to be in the domestic violence field, and so I do trainings on the neurobiology of trauma because it has all kinds of impacts both for adults and children. When you have kids that are experiencing all those challenges, it really does impact. And if we don't understand it, it is easy to misdiagnose. So actually, my wife and I were fostering 3 little kiddos, and like when the first one came into our home, we were told, oh, she's got a seizure disorder, because there'll be times where she just like goes catatonic basically and just stares. It's like, oh great, this is gonna be fun. I've got to watch her on the playground and everything else in case she has a seizure. Well, we got a month or so into it and never had a seizure, but what we did notice is there was times where she would just stop and just start staring. But we started noticing is at certain kind of triggering events, so like if she thought she was going to be left, or during visitation times or things like that. And so my wife's a social worker too, and has background in trauma-informed care and everything. And so we're very much aware of these things. I bet this is probably a trauma response, not a medical condition. And sure enough, as she stayed in a stable home, all those episodes started disappearing. And you do the testing, and it's like, oh, no, there's no brain scan that shows epilepsy, and the genetic test comes back negative. So able to rule that out, but it's because of that response to trauma. And yet, you have kids, if you don't have folks around them that are trauma informed, whether it's in their biological home or in the church or the school, then they can very easily get labeled as, oh, there's something medically wrong with them, or they've got these behavior issues, and so they're just a bad kid. And so just kind of going off of what Bryan said, if you are part of church, I think one of the most helpful things you can do is even have some trauma-informed care trainings in your church. Because if you've got youth programs or children's programs, your volunteers and your staff need to be very informed about how that can impact kids' behaviors, so that way you can offer the most helpful care. Question I have for you guys, especially Bryan. So Bryan, you were talking a lot about emphasizing work with your programs and everything. So my question is, what about seniors and the elderly, and how can we care for them and avoid creating dependency with them when maybe they, quote, can't work, or they have limited options?
Yeah, so great question, and I meant to touch on this point. So everybody has value and worth, and so we have about 120 volunteers every week that come throughout the week. And so there's lots of opportunities there and lots of age range. And on Thursdays, we pack about 700 meals, and we'll have a lot of retirees come. And kind of to Amanda's point, we've seen the same thing that the food co-op saw, is those volunteers become family to one another. So we've had individuals who have lost their spouse after 30, 40 years of marriage, and as a senior, they're alone, and they come and volunteer and they connect with people, and then people become friends and they go eat lunch afterwards, or go to, you know, a music show in Branson, those type of things. And then we've actually held funerals in our place for volunteers that have passed away, just because they have built that family connection. So we utilize our rewards program with a lot of volunteers, older volunteers as well, even physically disabled people. We have a guy that would come on Thursdays, and he had cerebral palsy to the point where all he could do was use one hand. He was wheelchair bound, and all he could do was use one hand. And we empowered him to color on bags for us that the meals are packed in. And he was extremely proud to be able to do that. And so I think it's, again, it goes back to relationship, right? It's talking with that person, figuring out what their gifts and talents and abilities are, and then trying to plug them in to the right role that they can grow in and where they feel valuable and dignified.
We're the same way within the church. We have many partners that need volunteers. Bright Futures Joplin, we have a group that goes over and packs snack packs. They do about 420 snack packs every week for schools. So that's on a rotation basis. We have a couple that goes over to Water Gardens every Monday, and they work in where the clothing is brought in, the donations. They go in and fold and sort out clothing. And then our group within the church is called Oasis. I can't remember what it stands for, but anyway, they just made it. I don't know. Anyway, so they actually help serve within the church. We hold community events, whatever. We just had our Baptist Association's annual meeting. They served dinner. So yeah, there's plenty of places for them to volunteer in and around the city.
I think the biggest challenge that we're seeing, and probably a lot of communities are, is safe and affordable housing for elderly. And that is difficult to not only find, but then be able to place them there, depending on if they have any disabilities, depending on what their income source is, if any. And so that's becoming more and more challenging. We have been able to partner with our RF Foundation, which is really a foundation geared towards retirees for our tiny house development. So we will have some older housing, but it's still challenging.
Add something to that. Just my comment more, not a question, is I think sometimes we think a person who has a disability or is elderly, like, they just don't have anything to contribute. We make an assumption that, you know, they're too old or they're too whatever. And not to assume that. I know Marcia and James have lots of stories about people that at first they're like, oh, can we ask that person to do something to earn because of their disability? And my favorite is the guy who came in and he only had 2 fingers on each hand. And I can't remember if it was these 2 or these 2. But anyway, they were stuffing envelopes that day and they were like, should we, you know, so they were like, well, here's what we're doing. You know, this is how our program works to earn it. And he sat down. It's all he'd ever known. He could stuff envelopes, and they were worried about asking. But there's usually something that somebody can do, you know, even if it's sitting alongside a volunteer and doing the smallest of tasks, or setting a goal or whatever. So.
Yeah, and I think piggybacking off of that, so I talked in my session about consumerism being one of those driving forces in our culture, and I think this ties into that because we very much view a person's worth based on their productivity in the economy. You know, if you can do a job and you can earn money, then you have value, but once you retire, I mean, we'll be nice to you because if you've paid your dues, but your worth starts diminishing, Bob. But oftentimes, you know, that's how we approach it. It's like, well, you're not really contributing to society anymore because you can't work a paying job, or you're not working a paying job. Whereas if you take more of the Christian perspective, like, no, your value is not tied to your economic productivity. Your value is tied to the fact that you're made in the image of God, and you still have gifts, you still have resources, you still have value. And it just might be a little bit more work to figure out what that looks like, post work, or for someone with a physical disability or who's elderly. But I think that's where the church really comes into play, to hold that idea of the image of God and say, no, what can you do, or how can you contribute, because God's not done with you yet. I know at COM we like to talk about this word of vocation. So because I think that's broader than just, because work sometimes has, I think, the message of like, oh, you're doing something for pay, whereas it may not be that. It might be, volunteering at your local nonprofit or your church, or, stuffing envelopes or something like that. But this language of vocation, like, what is it that you're called to do, and how do you fit into our community? I think I really like that word.
I'd like you to back up here because I didn't get it written down. Children of trauma.
Mm-hmm.
We have a lot of that in our church in Fairplay. And you mentioned something about a class or something like that our teachers, our Sunday school teachers could take.
So, trauma-informed care was the language I used. And actually, I know right now, I think Burrell is looking for places to do trauma-informed care classes.
Okay, we volunteer.
Because they reached out to me, I think yesterday they did before, like, hey, can we come and do it for you guys at COM for your staff? Because we've got some downtime the next few months, are looking for some places to do this. So that'd be an excellent starting place as well.
Do you have a contact name or
Was
person?
it the
Because
local?
Burrell's
Yeah, was it
huge.
the
Yeah,
local?
so I'll have to look up on my phone to see who exactly emailed me. It's one of our local Bolivar people, though. So I can get you that information, as well as, there's a lot of social workers and counselors in our community, whether at CMH or SBUs, like Naomi Sanders. I'd even be willing to come out. I'm not a professional person, but I've been in that work long enough I can at least give you a lot of the language behind it, if you don't need like credits for anything official or something like that. But yeah, trauma-informed care, and so I can help find some resources too.
There also, if you decide to, if your church joins the network, we recently did a webinar with an expert on ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Events Survey, ACEs.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, again, not like a certified training or anything, but that is part of the network. Membership is access to all of the webinars that we've had in our history. We have a webinar on a poverty-related topic every couple of months.
I'll give you one more. There's a great resource out there called The Boy Who Was Raised Like a Dog. It's a book by a psychiatrist that's an expert in childhood trauma. And basically, he takes about 10 of his cases and talks about all the different types of childhood trauma. And it'll break your heart, but it's very informative.
We're really seeing this in our church. We live in a very poor area. Our church is in a poor area.
Yep.
And a lot of the children are coming in that we take in. They know they get a meal, and so they come to have that meal. But, their parents are like, whatever they're doing, they're not paying attention. These kids are, and it's hard for us sometimes as a teacher to go in and work with them because you don't know what to do with them when they're bouncing off the wall.
Right. So that's why I love this book, because it will actually give you solutions based on different symptoms that's going on. He's got these different cases through there, and so it gives you at least a framework of where to start, right? But obviously, some of those cases you've still got to combine with some sort of therapy,
Sure.
But at least it gives you, instead of thinking it's ADHD, it could be this. Let me try this approach.
Yeah.
So,
Because that's what I'm seeing. I'm not big on filling kids up with drugs, never have been.
Right.
But and I don't believe that that's the solution.
right.
There's a little more behind that.
Yep.
And to show, like you say, don't tell me how much you care. Show me.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, it's a great book. It's a good resource, I think.
Okay, I
So
appreciate
we've had our
that.
whole staff read it.
Okay. What was the name of that again?
The Boy Who Was Raised Like a Dog.
Boy who was raised like a dog. Any other questions? If not, I've got one final question, but I'll give others an opportunity to ask too.
Micah, I was just going to say, and it's not a question, but rather a thank you. Only because I appreciate your starting off with the scriptures, because we all need to be reminded that the scriptures is heavy when it speaks about addressing the poor, but also the place that I personally have always had a challenge, and you and I have talked about this, is the verses that Paul says, if you don't work, you don't eat. And unfortunately, while America is a beautiful country and amazing for all it stands for, we become enablers of the society that we live in today. And it's heartbreaking to watch and see it just being perpetuated. But I appreciate both Bryan and Chip in the way that you're working alongside your communities to say, we're here to help you. And as Micah said, I want to give you a hand up, not a hand out.
Yep. Right.
And empowering people.
Yep.
And truly respecting them and valuing them, because we all are made in the image of God.
Yep.
Yes.
So thank you. It's
Well,
encouraging to know that you're not an island standing here, though you feel like an island sometimes. I mean, Father really has a heart for all mankind, and He wants us to have the same heart.
Yes.
But I've driven by many a panhandler, and we've said, no way, because you can see them all plotting with one another and hear stories about what's going on. It's like, that's not the healthy way to do this. There has to be another way that we can reach out. So thank you.
We're one flesh, so that's twice.
Yeah, and like I said, it's hard to say no sometimes, but sometimes no is the correct answer. But we don't want to be judgmental in it or callous and like, nope, you're just trying to game the system, whatever. It's like like Chip said, following up with the resources and the relationship. It's like, I'm saying no because I do care about you. I know there's something better for you. Yeah. And that's the key.
Father taught us a lesson at Christmas time one year. We were hosting some couples and teaching them, and there was one particular family that as they sat there, one was on disability and the wife was working in a local grocery store, and they were lamenting that, we've never been able to have Christmas with our kids, we can't afford presents, and we wait till after Christmas and go to the sales, and we said, let's enable them to have Christmas. And so our heart was genuine in that we wanted to enable them. Our Father taught us a real lesson. We enabled them and we gave them the money so they could go buy Christmas presents. And when they came back, they said, oh, we didn't buy presents. We waited till after Christmas and went to the sales. And I said, well, that just sort of, we wanted to help you have Christmas. We've done something horribly wrong here. We have not helped. We've only enabled.
And the next Christmas, the son and the mother, because I had seen him every week in the grocery store, was hinting around that it was going to be a repeat this next year.
Yes, they were
So
coming, you give once, you give twice.
Oh, there you
They were
go.
waiting for the handout again,
Yeah.
so
They were
they
waiting
could
for
go
the
to the
second
after
time around.
Christmas sales.
Good thing we'd had it twice.
We ruined this someplace.
No, it was good luck.
It was a good lesson for us.
Sometimes you have to learn I think most of us in this line of work have learned the hard
Oh,
way.
yeah.
So, but yeah, and I think as James Whitford, maybe at the True Charity Summit, that said something along the lines that, like, compassion's a great thing. Compassion's something that God gives us, but compassion's like a fire. If it's in its right bounds, it can be amazingly productive and very helpful. But if it goes out of control and it's not guarded by the right boundaries, it can be very destructive, right? And I think that's the important lesson for us is, like, we can clearly see from the scripture we're called to be compassionate, and that's something God's given us. But the next question is, how do we be compassionate in a helpful manner, which is hopefully today's sessions have maybe been helpful for everyone here. So final question for you guys over here. So what have you learned about people who are experiencing poverty, and what have they taught you?
I think the biggest thing they have taught me is the power of community. Middle class, myself included, we tend to pull in the driveway, hit the garage door button, pull in, close the garage door behind us, and go inside, or maybe we'll sit on our back deck. When we first started going to the motels, the sense of community was amazing. We would knock on a door and ask them if they needed any food. No, we don't need anything this week, but the people down in room 309, they're really struggling. And they just knew the interconnectedness of their neighbors. And I think just seeing, because relationships are so important to people in poverty, because it is about survival, they are very interconnected relationally wise. And I really believe that we all crave that. We all want that, even in middle class. We just haven't been very good at achieving it, which is why oftentimes we go to church and somebody says, "How are you doing?" And you say, "Good," and you walk on by, even though, maybe your kid just got busted for smoking pot the day before, and your boss is a jerk, and life's definitely not good, but we hide behind stuff. And people in poverty tend to be way more authentic with their junk, but at least you know where they're at. And I love that part of it, and it's helped me become more authentic and transparent back.
I think that the thing that I've learned, especially over the past few years, is how to love people well. How to love people, even difficult people. We have those people in our lives, and people that we meet in our neighborhoods or whatever. They may not like what we're doing. Once we tend to get up in their business, they don't like us anymore, but we still love them, and we have to love them well. And even though they're being difficult, and maybe I'm being difficult, I don't know, but I mean, it's whatever. I have learned how to love people unconditionally and not put parameters on that. They're going to mess up like I mess up. They're the same person as me. They're just in a low circumstance. And listen, I've been in low circumstances. So I would say that the biggest thing that I've learned, especially over the past few years, is how to love people and love difficult people well.
Yeah, I think for me, kind of echoing what Bryan said, the emphasis on community and relationships, because it is very much present. So I know when we were looking at how do we change up the pantry, we did lots of conversations with folks and asking okay, what do you like about the current model? What do you want to see in a future model? And also asking what do you do with the food that you get? Because especially with the drive-thru is pretty much no choice. But we had one lady is I get lots of stuff I can't use right now because of my diet, and honestly I don't need a whole lot, but what I do is I live in an apartment complex and I share with others, and we've got one of my neighbors, she'll cook up a lot of stuff and we'll have dinner parties together and things. And so it's that's nothing that we are doing. It's this is just happening organically among them. And so sometimes we come into these communities and we say oh, I'm the expert, because again, you have all these needs. You don't have money, you have limited food, and so we need to come in and fix you. Whereas many times there's amazing things happening already, particularly on the community side of that. If we just tap into that and become partners with them, you can unleash some amazing forces as well. So I think that's one thing I've learned, as well as just simply the resilience of people that do experience poverty. Because you hear some of these stories how are you making it? Because I would have folded a long time ago. Or if I was going through that, I'd have a drug addiction too. And so I think those are some things I've learned. And I think it's an important question for anyone who's in this work, whether in the church world or nonprofit or just on your own, is that getting out of that mindset that you're not the helper or the savior, but you are truly a partner, and they have just as much to teach you as you do to them. So. All right, well, thank you, Chip and Bryan, so much for spending your day and all this time, and hopefully it's beneficial to you guys. And as a few wrap-up notes, so we have been recording these sessions. Hopefully they turn out okay. And so once we have them all edited and cleaned up, we'll shoot those out, probably via email to everyone, and probably have them on our website as well. That way, if you have folks that hey, you need to hear this, or your church is hey, you need to hear this, that's our hope, is get the message out and continue these conversations. And we'll also probably be emailing a survey over the next week too, just to get your thoughts and inputs. So thank you again so much. Let's go close out in prayer.
Thank you guys. Thank you for your time.
Dear Father, we thank you so much for the opportunity to gather, to learn, to dive into your word, to study what you have to say. And I do pray that as we go from this place, that it would not just be a fun time with good food and fellowship, but that we would leave these doors ready to take action as well, that in our own lives, in our churches, in our workplaces, and wherever we go, that we would have a heart of compassion for the people around us, particularly those that are struggling or maybe lost, and that we would find ways to build relationships with them, to join with them in community, and together walk towards the fullness of life and the human flourishing that you desire for each and every one of us. So I pray that you would use this time for your glory and use it to continue the conversations in our churches and wherever we may go. All these things we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you, guys.
How did you guys do your neighborhood stuff?